My name is Dario Hasenstab. I'm here with Baldur Hagrids, and we are back with the Western Bubble podcast. Today, we have a bit of a new format we're trying out because we are recording only 6 hours before the publication of this episode, something we usually don't do, but this time we're doing it on purpose, simply because every time we try to record on this topic, new current events start developing and are completely kind of making what we say a few days ago almost irrelevant. So please also bear that in mind for the next few days, right? So this will be published in 6 hours. Today is Tuesday, the 24th of June. The time is 17:30. And given how the world is going, Baldur, this episode might be completely irrelevant in 2 days because of, I don't know, Australia attacking New Zealand, right? It could be happening. There's just so many things happening all the time.
Yeah, it has been insanity in terms of news developments, and we'll discuss that a little bit. I think the most immediate thing that we just don't know about is at the time of recording, it is not clear whether the any ceasefire between Iran or Israel is going to be half serious or not. So when people listen to this tomorrow or on Thursday, there might already be new developments. So we have to be careful in making predictions in that sense.
Because just to reconstruct what has been happening the past few days and how crazy they have been. So you're mentioning a ceasefire. In last week's episode, we were still kind of debating or thinking about Israel just having started its special military operation against Iran. And we were kind of thinking, will the United States get involved or not? And since then, the United States has got involved. So that was a huge development. And we thought, that's what the episode will be about. Again, before there was simply war between Iran and Israel. And there are so many more things that have been happening in the past few weeks, right? Because right before that topic, we were talking about Donald Trump sending the National Guard to California to kind of curb the protests that were taking place there. These protests actually distracted us from an episode we were doing on the falling out between Elon Musk and Donald Trump, right? That was distracting us from the big, beautiful bill, which is still exists, but no one talks about it anymore. The big, beautiful bill is kind of to start distracting us from the tariffs that were implemented. We have been experiencing something that is called kind of flooding the zone, right? Where us, so the two of us, but also civil society, our listeners, the judiciary, the media, are kind of purposefully overstimulated with all these different events that are taking place simultaneously, which ultimately has the result that civil society, media, and the judiciary cannot hold authorities to account any longer.
That's the major takeaway from this. Now, you used the word purposefully. I'm not sure to what extent there's actually conspiracy to do this, but it's clear that in terms of policy making, it has been incredibly useful for specifically this White House, because almost all the issues you mentioned are related to Washington and the Trump administration, to essentially flood the news like this, because typically the reaction to their policies are bad because they are bad policies, whether it is the big beautiful bill, whether it is the tariffs, whether it is California, whether it is Elon Musk and the fight between him and Trump. All of it is bad policy making because just the current administration is incompetent. It's a bad administration, regardless of your philosophy, ideology. What they do often doesn't work, or it is counterproductive, or it is destructive. And on top of that, there is a kind of agenda of let's burn down the house. And for that, the chaos of having major news events every 24 or 48 hours exactly leads to what you said. It just leads to us not being able to hold people to account. A proper functioning society in 1, 2, 3 months' time is still thinking about the big beautiful bill and still saying this was terrible. How did this happen? A proper country with a proper legal administration would actually look at what ICE has been doing, would pulse everything and say, let's calmly look at this for the next few months, see if what ICE's policy are acceptable, and then we can restart it if so. No, immediately There's a new news item, and politically, no one is interested in it anymore because we're now all obsessing with Israel or Iran. It's almost more damaging than any of the specific policies that there are so many coming at us at once, and that as a result, basic institutions, both in terms of media as well as in legal institutions, are no longer allowed to do their thing.
Well, there's also other beneficiaries from all of this. I mean, you mentioned the White House, but there's also the government of Israel at the moment. I mean, everyone is focusing on Iran. People have shifted their focus away from the horrible atrocities they're committing in Gaza. I mean, actually, right? It's really concerning to see that the death numbers have been going up, but no one really talks about it anymore. And then obviously, add to that the corruption trial, the problems within the coalition. So that's also a huge beneficiary of this.
Yeah, essentially, those that commit bad policy, either bad because of incompetence, which is very often the case, or because of unethical approaches to the world, are benefiting from this. And it's important for people to realize, right, it's not just that our brain is just flooded with information, but in order to hold those who are most powerful to account, there needs to be political momentum, right? You can't just, it's not, look, if I drive too fast on the motorway, the police will hold me to account, no problem, because I'm an easy target for the police. They can stop me, and if I drive off, they arrest me. Easy peasy, lemon squeezy. But when you want to hold someone like Netanyahu or Trump to account, there needs to be significant political support for that, both in terms of the political parties, but also in terms of the country. And when it comes to Israel and Gaza, the world, basically. And that support loses momentum the moment there's a new next shiny thing. So you can never, as if you are a court and you want to take the White House to task, or you are a media outlet and you want to expose the violence in Gaza, that becomes impossible if the world no longer pays attention to you. And that's exactly the huge danger of what we see in 2025.
And of course, all of this is also happening with actors that are maybe not incompetent and maybe not evil, but because we're also kind of not focusing on just normal actors doing their policy, right? So, I mean, we will get to this later on the episode, but NATO currently discussing raising defense spending to 5% is something that 10 years ago would have lasted for 6 months and would have been a huge, huge discussion. And now it's a footnote in the news, while everyone only focuses on their big other shiny things. But as I said, we will focus on that later on in the episode, because Balder, kind of to counter the flooding of the zone, you came up with a new format that we want to experiment with today, and that's a public service announcement. And you want to give us a public service announcement on Iran and Iran potentially or not, maybe developing nuclear weapons.
Yes, and I should point out that this is something that has been in my classes, as you know, for 10 years, 15 years at university. It's something that I and many others have been saying for a long time, but now finally on social media and the internet, people have caught on a little bit as well. So it may not seem particularly original anymore. It is still very, very important to realize. And I thought I'll do it in terms of public service announcements with 5 steps, easy to basically follow, and specifically about the insanity of saying we are entitled to bomb Iran, whether it's Israel or the United States, by the way, because of their nuclear program. I hope you're excited by this, Dario.
I'm very excited to listen to our public service announcement on Iran.
Number 1. There is no public evidence that they are actively developing nuclear weapons. The only assertions about an active weapons program comes from the same people who have been crying wolf for over 40 years. 2. If Iran does have nuclear weapons or in development, it would take years to actually make them able to effectively deploy them. 3. If Iran at any time does have operational nuclear weapons, it would be highly unlikely that they would use them offensively, since that would mean essential suicide for the Iranian state. 4. Regardless, the possession of nuclear weapons does not legitimize military intervention. 5. Preemptive or preventive war has been thoroughly debunked as a legitimate choice.
I actually do not. So, first of all, thank you for your public service announcement. But I actually dislike you using and also everyone else using the term, right, crying out wolf. Because in that story, there was a wolf at the end, right? So it kind of allows the Netanyahus of this world to say that I've been saying it for all these years. Eventually, when you stop believing me, there will be one, right? Because as of now, there are no indicators that it would ever be the case. But I think the message itself is, of course, really important. Is that, there are all these video snippets out there now where they kind of show Netanyahu telling the world that Iran is 2-3 years away from a nuclear weapon. And then that is from 1995.
Yeah, no, and even the first report, and I've been saying this for decades now because it's just out there. The first report about Iran being a nuclear danger was from Mossad in 1981, and then there was another one from the CIA, I think, in 1985. And Netanyahu is fine, but even before that, the narrative was already established, right? Because of course, it makes sense that if you are the West, and certainly if you're Israel, and you see your good friend the Shah being overthrown, and you all of a sudden have an Islamic theocracy in Iran, then that would lead to your worst case kind of fantasy of what could go wrong. If things go really wrong, what could go wrong? Well, militarily, Iran probably can't do much to us, conventionally, but nuclear weapons would be a disaster. And this is in the 1980s when nuclear weapons are still very much sort of providing a cloud over everything that happens in the world because the Cold War isn't over yet. So you can see where the theoretical thinking comes from in the 1980s. Oh, this would be a worst case scenario. But that worst case scenario gets translated into practical warnings about Iran being this close to having the nuclear weapons. And that is where the insanity comes in.
Because so I have time and time again, I have these moments where I realize that I'm young, and that people like you or also others have just seen more things and have seen the same developments before, right? So I can study history, and I can kind of make the connection that, hey, what we're seeing right now is really similar to what we saw before World War I, but emotionally it is not as effective and as intensive as now myself, having observed for 10 years that each year, or basically every few months, there's an announcement that Iran is this close to the bomb. They're only a few weeks away. And now for myself, I'm thinking, wait, I've been hearing this for 10 years. Balder has been hearing this for 20, 30 years. Others have been hearing this for 40 years. I feel like there might not be something to it. And then again, even if they are this close to, right, developing uranium to basically a level of 90%, right, which is always the big concern. As you mentioned in your second point, that does not mean that they have a nuclear weapon in the end, because you still need to attach it to like a nuclear warhead, and you still need to test the missile, and you still need to make sure it works. Newsflash, North Korea also took a few years, and we still don't know whether the North Korean nuclear weapon actually will fly further than 50 miles.
Yeah, and that is so important about all of this, because if you sometimes listen to Washington spokespeople, especially Israeli spokespeople, it feels as if this doesn't happen now, that tomorrow or maybe next month there is an existential danger to Israel. But just temporarily, let's assume that program is actually happening and that they are targeting a actual existing weapons program. If tomorrow Iran announces we now have sufficient expertise and we've got the technology ready for nuclear weapons, it would take at least 5, maybe 10 years to have any practical ability to use it at a minimum, right? Looking at North Korea, it might be much longer, but I would give Iran more technological and scientific credits than North Korea, by the way, which should also be a sign of why hasn't Iran developed it yet? If North Korea can do it, why doesn't Iran have them yet? But it takes years and years to make it operational. So this sense of urgency, even if the claims are true, is complete nonsense. And then on top of that, there is, of course, the whole argument, okay, even if they have nuclear weapons, hold on, Israel developed nuclear weapons, North Korea developed nuclear weapons, India, Pakistan developed nuclear weapons. The world did actually not attack them. Why would we all of a sudden attack Iran? Simply because we don't like them or we feel that they're somehow a threat to Israel. You know who's a threat to India? Pakistan. Do you know who's a threat to Pakistan? India. But the world would never accept any strike, nuclear or otherwise, of one against the other. So the whole narrative about this is just so full of holes and so much insanity, and it might actually lead to it becoming the boy who cried wolf in some ways, because you're rightfully pointing out that in the story we know that the wolf comes. Well, all of this is actually leading to a situation where it would make perfect sense for Iran to actually start developing nuclear weapons, because then Israel can't touch them anymore.
So while I subscribe to point number 3, right, the fact that even if they have nuclear weapons, they might not use them. Here, I do want to put a bit of individual responsibility on Iran, because if you tell everyone for 40 years that you want to annihilate Israel, then that is a little bit on you. Right, so here, of course, right, it doesn't justify well, I mean, I think the argument still stands, because we can look at India, we can look at Pakistan, we can look at North Korea, that it's suicidal to use a nuclear weapon offensively. Right, so that for me stands, but there's 2% of that whole argument where I would say, hey, I mean, if you spend 40 years kind of proclaiming that you want to annihilate this other state, then you have to right, look in the mirror, take a deep, long look, and say, well, was this really necessary? Is this really a productive way to act on the international stage?
Well, yes, absolutely, and no, not quite. Yes, absolutely. I completely agree with that, with the idea that, look, Iran is not helpful. Iran is a self-declared enemy of Israel. There are lots of reasons why they declare that internally, but also they want to portray themselves as the last nation standing, facing the failure of the Arab world to stop Israel. Then Iran will say, we as Persians, as non-Arabs, we will take care. We need to resist Israeli occupation. There are lots of reasons why they are self-proclaimed enemies of Israel, but it is absolutely true that their rhetoric has been aggressive, violent, threatening to Israel. No doubt about it. And if anyone in Israel says, we've got a problem with Iran, obviously nobody can blame you for that. Iran also has a problem with Israel, and so the Iranians can claim the same, but that is clear. So there I completely follow you. On top of that, to further reinforce your point, Iran has not been particularly productive in the way that it has been sponsoring Hamas, Hezbollah, who have taken actual military and terrorist action against Israel. Now, Iran does that through those organizations to have some kind of plausible deniability, because they know that they can't start a war against Israel directly because they would lose.
And because Israel has a nuclear weapon.
And because Israel has a nuclear weapon, and the United States has a nuclear weapon, and the UK has a nuclear weapon. So there are lots of reasons why Iran can't, militarily confront Israel. So they do it through proxy groups. No doubt the Houthis have sent rockets or missiles from Yemen, also connected to Iran. So it is very clear that Iran has not been helpful in their aggression towards Israel. There I completely follow you. I would say, however, one, the rhetoric about Iran wanting to wipe Israel off the map has often been exaggerated in the West. There's this famous mistranslation from then President Ahmadinejad, who was supposedly had said, we are something along the lines of, we are planning to wipe Israel off the face of the earth, or something like that. And then it turned out that it was just a bad translation by a Western translator, and that's not actually what he said in reality. Now, so I don't want to have anyone misunderstand this. Of course, Iran uses language that is aggressive and threatening to Israel, but Iran hasn't that explicitly, certainly not in recent decades, said Israel has to be removed from the map. It is more like, we oppose Israel, we stand against Israel, those kinds of things. And that is, content-wise, is a different thing, right? Because if you as a state say, we are fighting Israel, that's different from Israel needs to be eradicated. So there's a bit of a subtle change there. But overall, I fully agree with what you're saying. That Iran hasn't been helpful in that sense either. Obviously not. Nonetheless, that's still not a reason to attack a country. You can't just say, because you're financing some groups that are opposing us. We now have a right to bomb your place. No, because according to that, then the whole 20th century would have been full of the United States bombing the Soviet Union and the Soviet Union bombing the United States, because of them using proxy groups to actually oppose each other.
And then kind of, right, because that covers the fourth point, right, that regardless of the possession of nuclear weapons, it does not legitimize any military intervention. And the last one is that preemptive or preventive war has been thoroughly debunked as a legitimate choice. And here, it really seems like the West is slowly but surely losing it. Because that's kind of, right, so kind of this preventive action is also what Putin used with his special military operation against Ukraine, kind of saying that, here, NATO is pulling Ukraine in and they want to use Ukraine basically to fall into Russia and so on, and they will kill us. So we're going to do a 3-day, sorry, Vladimir, a 3-day military operation that has lasted 3 years already to kind of get rid of it, right? And then the West rightfully kind of condemned that, right? According to international law, hey, these are the rules in the rules-based world order, right? That we've given ourselves, or the West has given the rest. We condemn that, and I think rightfully so. And we've mentioned this many, many times in previous episodes. But I mean, let's take a step back here. What Israel did to Iran 12 days ago. Right, where you start attacking a country, taking out its air defense, you take out senior military leaders, you attack military targets, you attack kind of nuclear facilities, you kill scientists and so on, and you do this for days and days and days. I mean, call me crazy, but that's the reason why in the introduction I did call it a special military operation, if not a war. And here the West has kind of not condemned it, right? I mean, Friedrich Merz, the German chancellor, even said that, Israel is doing our dirty work.
No, and then also, let's not forget, just the United States, even dropping the bombs, that, hey, we want to set back the program, that's preemptive action. That is just not acceptable. You're absolutely right about the case of Ukraine, but it goes much further back than that, right? So, first of all, the principle doesn't make any sense, right? To say, I'm starting a war to avoid a war is just logically inconsistent. And then you say, but I'm just doing a small little thing so that the bigger thing doesn't happen. Yeah, no, war is war. The moment you bomb a country, you are committing an act of war. Let's be clear about that. But the best case that has been, of course, mentioned a lot this past week in the media is Iraq. First of all, the accusations against Iraq turned out to be complete nonsense. There were no serious weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11. But in 2003, the United States invaded with the main message, if we don't do it, then Iraq is going to attack us at some point, which was, of course, insanity. Of course, Iraq wouldn't attack the United States. But that led to one of the worst foreign policy disasters for the United States and its allies in recent memory. The idea that you can just go in and sort of correct something with military action is simply untenable if you look at the reality, the complexity of the world. The moment you drop bombs, you create dynamics that you cannot control. So practically, it doesn't make any sense. You create much more many more long-term headaches than that you solve with this kind of thing. So practically, there is no basis for it. Theoretically, philosophically, it doesn't make any sense. It is horrible. You are the aggressor. And yet, the West has made itself the arbiter of what is right or wrong. So if Russia does it, somehow it's not acceptable because they are evil. If the West does it, then it's for the right reasons because the West somehow are the ones who only have good intentions in their heart. And this is, by the way, for another episode maybe, but one of the major concerns I have about NATO and Russia, that if war breaks out between Russia and NATO, I know who is the one who's going to start first. It's going to be NATO preemptively striking Moscow, which would be terrifying.
Well, speaking about this level of hypocrisy by the West, I think this is a great moment to listen to NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, your former prime minister and fellow countryman, Because NATO is coming to the Netherlands, is coming to The Hague, having a lovely little meeting there. And so ahead of this meeting, he was asked by a reporter whether kind of U.S. attacks against Iran, whether there isn't a certain level of hypocrisy involved if you don't condemn that versus condemning Russia. And let's listen to his answer here.
Secretary General, NATO's position for more than 3 years has been very consistent. It's been criticising Russia for breaching the rules-based international order by invading Ukraine. Doesn't all of that seem very hypocritical, given the US's recent actions, which are clearly dubious under international law?
Well, I don't agree with that assessment at all. Obviously, NATO is concentrated on the Euro-Atlantic, but I do not at all, not one syllable of your assessment, sorry, on what you just said. With all the respect, of course, for your news outlet, which I always respect, but I think you have this completely wrong.
Balder, correct me if I'm wrong, but first of all, he didn't answer the question. He just said you're wrong. But then Mark Rutte didn't even explain why the person was wrong. And he just said, no, you're wrong. I disagree with every syllable of the statement.
Yes, but before playing the clip, you said, let's listen to his answer. I thought, wow, you're being generous here, because it is absolutely, it is a non-answer. It is a very valid question, of course. But it shows the problem that someone like Rutte and NATO are in, right? Rutte has done the same thing when it came to Trump's aggressive language against Canada, but especially Denmark when it came to Greenland. Like, we are going to annex Greenland and kind of threatening it. Rutte was asked about this, and he basically said, well, this is not a NATO problem, even though it is, as NATO, Denmark and the United States are two NATO countries. How can this not be a NATO problem? So what you see here is that NATO as an alliance doesn't make any sense anymore. The organization philosophically should not exist. Operationally, it's very efficient. It's a very well-run organization, but philosophically, it should not exist. And Rutte is trying to basically play this game where countries are allowed to take their NATO hat off, take aggressive action, do something horrible, and claim, oh, no, this is not NATO. This is not something that Rutte has to be concerned about. And then afterwards put a NATO hat on again and say, oh, okay, now we're all part of NATO and we are supporting each other and we have a common agenda. Of course, that doesn't make any sense. And I'm horrified by the fact that someone like Rutte is not taking any principled stance on this and is not understanding the damage, long-term damage he does to the reputation of the West and NATO by allowing this kind of thing. I know that he sees his own role as to keep it all together, like with glue and with duct tape and with whatever way he can keep it together without falling apart. But I think in the longer run, it's just accelerating the demise of NATO, because this is just not sustainable in this way.
Well, Rutte is a long-term disappointment to the Western Bubble podcast. There is a more recent one, at least on a foreign policy level. Donald Trump has really disappointed me from a Western Bubble perspective, Balder, because he always... No, I'm serious, because Trump has always been an ally to our cause when it comes to Western foreign policy, because Trump always said we shouldn't go into these useless wars, right? Of course, is Trump on every other level a huge problem within the Western bubble? Yes. Is he a symptom of the Western bubble? Absolutely. But so far, he has always kind of held up our cause. And now, with his decision to bomb Iran, right, and kind of taking pride in it, he's seriously disappointing me.
Yeah, I did have to laugh, because just the idea of being disappointed by Donald Trump is funny. How can you be even more disappointed in the man? But yeah, no, absolutely. I think you make a very valid point there. And it reminds me of something I was asked about in November 2024 during one of my lectures. A student asked, okay, so now Trump has won the elections. What does this mean? And at the time, my answer was, this is probably really bad news for the United States. I didn't know, by the way, how bad it was going to be, but internally for US institutions, this is terrible news, because this is his second term and he has an axe to grind and he's going to go full out. But for the rest of the world, it's probably not that bad. And even that was my reaction then, right? And even with the tariffs, I had something like, of course, this is terrible policy making. from a US perspective, but it might actually just accelerate kind of a decoupling of the United States from Europe. The transatlantic alliance might actually sort of drift apart, which is good news for everyone. It's an unfortunate short-term blip, but in the long run, it might make the world a bit more stable and a bit healthier. Not because he intends to do that, but intuitively because he doesn't like foreign entanglement, and he ran on a platform of we should not be involved in other people's wars. We should not make the mistakes that Democrats are making all the time. That was his whole platform. So then you look at the first term of Donald Trump, and it is relatively consistent with that, with, by the way, interestingly, the exception of him pulling out of the nuclear treaty with Iran, which is, of course, a foundation that has led to where we are now in 2025. But overall, I honestly thought that he wouldn't do this kind of nonsense. You would expect Democrats to be more likely to go into this, or sort of Republicans, traditional Republicans, more into this than the MAGA crowd. And it is kind of horrifying. Now, he has tried to put it in a context of, I'm bombing to create peace, right? The moment he bombed on Saturday, he announced this, is immediately in that press conference, he said, and now it's time for peace. And now Iran has to make peace. So he, in his twisted mind, thought, okay, I can bomb now, and that will make me go down in history as the peacemaker because I'm not giving Iran any options. And now on Tuesday the 24th, while we're recording, that is still very much the mindset he's in. And he's actually more upset with Israel than Iran at the moment for not being peaceful enough in their approach.
Who would have thought that Israel isn't a peaceful country at the moment? Again, the reason why I'm disappointed is because I thought the only thing you could rely on with Donald Trump is that he is MAGA all the way. And he even said the other day, right? He said it that, hey, I'm MAGA and I define what MAGA is, and you shut the unkind word up. Which I thought was like, yeah, Donald, do it, right, MAGA? And the whole MAGA platform base was behind him, kind of saying that, hey, don't do it, don't go to war. What this showed to me is how strong these traditional Western bubble dynamics are within the West, right? Because immediately, like the Lindsey Grahams and Ted Cruz's of this world were creeping out of the hole that they were supposed to be in, right? These tiny little men, and lobbying all over Washington for the United States to go to war here with Iran, and at first I thought that Trump would be able to kind of shake them off, right, as he has done in before. But when it comes to the US going to war and using their big, beautiful bombs, it's a really, really powerful dynamic.
Yeah, it's very deep inside of us. I would argue that it shows, and it surprised me. I didn't think it would be to this extent, that Trump is still listening to those hardcore Republicans. You mentioned Cruz, but there are more. Cruz, Lindsey Graham, to a certain extent Marco Rubio, even though he's supposed to be the adult in the room, which says a lot. And there is this whole bunch of sort of Republicans who were there in 2003, who were even there in the 1990s, who were good friends with Joe Biden, by the way, at the time, who agreed on foreign policy and the need to aggressively militarily follow through on warnings, and that they still have access to Trump's thinking. I find it surprising, but then again, I don't understand Donald Trump at all, so who am I? And that deep delusion about the West being able to shape the world in its own image through military means is deeply, deeply destructive and deeply erroneous. The culture of violence that we have kind of created, especially since 9/11, right? I mean, with the war on terror, we essentially said, okay, all the violence that we can apply is now justified because we're fighting terrorists and they are difficult to find. They are anonymous. Nobody walks around with a t-shirt saying, I'm a terrorist. So we have to basically bomb everyone who might be a terrorist. We're going to invade countries because we are the victims of this horrible attack. And now we are allowed to do whatever we want. By the way, you could apply those two sentences to exactly the experience of Israel from 2023 onwards. That kind of created a culture of violence. And I want to reiterate how little people in the street in the Netherlands or in France or the UK or the United States actually realize about the violence that their countries are inflicting. In Syria, over 40,000 bombing runs. 40,000 times NATO countries have bombed in Syria and northern Iraq. That is an insane number. We are so used to using the military to somehow what we think is solve our problems, even though it doesn't solve anything. It only leads to death and destruction. It's almost as if we're now a death cult in the West, but we don't realize it, right? We pretend to celebrate life, but in reality, we are the bringers of death. And then we dare to complain about a country like China for being a threat to the world. Well, China is not bringing that death to other countries. China is not bombing other countries. But somehow we are still in this weird bubble that we're the good guys. And within that kind of bubble, policies like this, like let's bomb Iranian nuclear facilities for no good reason, can happen.
I mean, the United States has bombed a lot of particularly Muslim countries, of course, in the last in the last 20 years. I mean, Iran just being the newest one here, and I mean, so you said, oh, how little the average Western bubble, or like the average Westerner knows about this. What really didn't surprise me, is how little Ted Cruz, one of the main advocates of let's go bomb Iran, actually knows about Iran. And we recorded an episode on Tucker Carlson, I think about a year and a half ago, when he interviewed Putin. Another one of those tiny little men who just happens to be out there. And I felt like we kind of ended our relationship with Tucker Carlson back then, because he became irrelevant, right? So we kind of said, hey, we'll kind of give you a final passing, and then ciao cacao. But he's back, and how did he get back into kind of our attention is by suddenly being kind of on our side, at least when it comes to let's not bomb other countries. And he interviewed Ted Cruz and asked him a very simple question. It's like, hey, what's the population of Iran? And then Ted Cruz answered this.
How many people live in Iran, by the way?
I don't know the population.
At all?
No, I don't know the population.
You don't know the population of the country you seek to topple?
How many people live in Iran?
92 million.
Okay. Yeah,
How could you not know that?
I don't sit around memorizing population tables.
Well, it's kind of relevant because you're calling for the overthrow of the government.
Boulder, I mean, if I had to ask you the question, how many people live in Iran, what would you have answered?
I probably would have said something like 90 million, because I like to stick to large round numbers if I don't know the exact date. I mean, it might be a few more or less, but 90 million would be my guess.
It's actually you're actually closer than Tucker Carlson, because according to the World Bank, there are 90.6 million people living in Iran. I don't know where Tucker Carlson got his number from, but it's kind of astonishing that someone like Ted Cruz, who is so keen on let's bomb this country, knows so little about it, right? I mean, if I advocate for a policy, I better make sure I know what the policy is about.
This is also, by the way, the sign, so you're absolutely right, of course, the ignorance has always been there among serious policymakers, but this is also a sign of a country that has the luxury to use military intervention, that has the luxury to bomb places without feeling the repercussions. So Iran is not that important to Cruz, so he doesn't need to know much about it. But he knows that the United States can bomb Iran, and that there won't, well, at least hopefully, that there won't be much pushback against that, because it's the United States. The United States is all powerful. It's also the reason why your average Israeli knows surprisingly little about Palestinians. It's actually, there have been lots of opinion polls on that. The basic knowledge about Palestine, about the West Bank, the history of Palestinians, Gaza, there is very little known about them, because they are not that important or relevant. You can take military aggression against them, you can kill them, and they won't kill you, which is different from, for example, policymakers in the United States in the 1960s, 1970s, who knew an awful lot about the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union was actually a threat. And if you would have asked a senator, well, not maybe every senator, but certainly those who are making foreign policy about what is the population of Soviet Union, what is their military expenditure, etc., they would have been able to give you that answer, right? So the United States is in a place, and the West in general, but specifically the United States is in a place where they decide to engage in acts of war against countries that they are essentially ignorant about. Almost like those people that sometimes late night shows and all that interview in the streets in Los Angeles or New York, and they ask them, hey, should we bomb North Korea? And people in the street say, yeah, we should bomb them. And then they show a map of the world, say, could you please point to where North Korea is on the world map? And then they point to Canada or Mexico or something like that, right? It is a ignorance in the minds of people because they don't need to know and they feel comfortable using violence because there are no real repercussions. And needless to say, that is probably not a good basis to go to war.
Unfortunately, Ted Cruz, now it seems like in the United States overall he is pretty alone with this take because even Democrats have abandoned that position. But Democrats used to be some of the bigger fans on let's go and bomb another country and bring some freedom to them, which makes me particularly upset now when I have to listen to people like Chuck Schumer, who is one of those long-term Democrats, taking no responsibility for what we're seeing today. Right, so they are obviously very quick to criticize Trump. Rightfully so. I would also criticize Trump right now. But without kind of looking in the mirror and realizing and saying that, hey, maybe us laying the foundation, and with us, I mean, right, the Clintons of this world and the Obamas of this world, of, hey, it's okay to attack another country without getting congressional approval, right? I mean, it's not a war, it's a special military operation, right? I'm outraged by the fact that now they're just criticizing him without taking any responsibility. You are the reason why the United States is okay with kind of just bombing another country.
Yeah, and this is one of the things that I always find a bit weird from media and certainly liberals in the world, right? So we obviously talk a lot about Trump at the moment because he's president of the United States. He's the one who makes policy. But I don't spend a lot of emotions on Trump because we know who Trump is. We know what he, sometimes he does some weird stuff and some very destructive stuff. But as a man, I've got him kind of placed in my brain and my mind, and I don't get angry with him. He's clearly someone I will never properly understand. My anger, my frustration, my emotions go to the Democratic Party and to the liberal establishment for the past 25 years, who have exactly set up a world in which the Trumps, and if you like in Europe, the extreme right, can do what they're doing. It's these center, and often center left, sometimes center right, liberals who pretend that they're the reasonable ones in the room, who have had completely inconsistent policy, who were cheerleaders for the war on terror during the war on terror, who removed Gaddafi from power, who engaged in a civil war in Yemen, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, etc., in Syria, who then all of a sudden act as if what Trump is now doing is outrageous and unacceptable. And that to me is so disingenuous. It is so horrifyingly dishonest. At least Trump is in some way honest in his simplicity and, weird decision making where he doesn't really know what he's going to do the following day. But those at the center who have created the foundation for this destruction to occur and not to actually be clear and principled in their decisions. For example, now still saying, okay, we don't approve of what Trump does with respect to Iran with bombing, but we do approve of the idea of regime change, or we do agree that Iran is the big problem, therefore creating this enormous moderate kind of blanket that Trump can fall back on, rather than saying, hey, the United States just bombed a country, we should never have done that, we should be ashamed of ourselves, no excuse, let's pull out. Or Israel is committing ethnic cleansing in Gaza, no excuse, we need to pull out and stop all the weapons. No, we think it's a bit extreme, but we still kind of agree with the underlying patterns. It is that kind of attitude from that center political base that is by far the most destructive, because that allows the crazy ones, that allows the extremists to actually burn the world down.
I really didn't want to bring up this topic, but unfortunately you kind of did. Isn't it funny how Donald Trump can control Israel with regards to its attacks on Iran and can be very tough on them to stop it. But when they're committing ethnic cleansing, which I think the two of us are kind of in agreement on, I think most of the factors for it are kind of present now. Nothing. Silence. Israel, don't bomb Iran because it doesn't fit into our narrative right now. But who cares about Gaza?
But it's visible everywhere, also in Europe. So last week there was this parliamentary vote in the Netherlands. One of the political parties, sort of the old school socialists, they introduced a bill that essentially said that the Netherlands should stop supplying the Israeli Iron Dome, because apparently there are 6 main Dutch suppliers that are supplying weaponry and technology necessary for the Iron Dome to function in Israel. The Iron Dome is basically this whole system to keep Israel safe from missile and rocket attacks from the outside, Hezbollah, Hamas, or Iran or Yemen, whatever. And they introduced this bill. And the Netherlands went crazy, basically arguing, how dare you, because this is just a defensive thing. Israel, how you want Jewish people to die in Israel by introducing this bill? How dare you suggest that we should stop Israel the ability to defend itself with the Iron Dome? This is a purely defensive, civilian-based issue, and you should stay away from that. Rather than saying, hang on, Israel can do what they do because they feel themselves to be invulnerable, because they know that they can't be really hit back, or at least in only very limited fashion. And maybe we shouldn't send weapons, whether they're defensive or offensive, to a country that is attacking another country, Iran, and that is committing ethnic cleansing in Gaza. Maybe, just as a suggestion, maybe we should stop doing that for a while until Israel stops killing civilians, right? Just as a little break from the regular scheduling. And yet in the Netherlands, people were outraged with this nonsense of, oh, you just want Israeli citizens to die by introducing this bill. It's that center position of, bombing Iran might be a bit much, but overall, the tone is okay. And overall, we need to be supportive of Israel. Overall, we need to be aggressive against Iran. It is that is allowing the damage to take place. And the lack of principle, the lack of basic rational thinking about these issues, and the lack of any practical record to show any kind of success, creates this horrific trifecta for the Western center middle classes that they should be deeply, deeply ashamed of.
And on top of that, or exactly because of that thinking, NATO and particularly Europe are now thinking about increasing defense spending to 5%. Because we have created all these enemies in the world. Some of them we've created for real. Some of them we are creating in our minds. And now we're surrounded by enemies. So we need 5%. And Boulder, it's time for your second public service announcement on Europe needs to increase its defense spending to 5%.
1. There's no strategic need for NATO 5% defense spending. There are much more productive ways to spend money. Russia will not invade Western Europe. 2. Even if they did, the West is capable of defending itself, outspending Russia by a significant margin. 3. Whenever someone argues that this is not the case, ask them to describe a realistic scenario in which Russia would invade. They won't be able to. 4. The result of all of this increase in defense spending, besides less money for actually useful things, is that the West will likely be the aggressor, the first mover for war. 5. The only ones who have some legitimate concerns are Baltic countries within NATO. They require a more robust common defense protocol, not more defense spending.
Boulder, I'm a bit confused about point number 1, because you say that Russia won't invade Western Europe. And then you say in your last point that, hey, like the only ones who kind of have to worry are the Baltics. But because of Article 5, if the Baltics are attacked, then that means everyone is attacked and everyone retaliates, right? So what do we do about this?
Yeah, so I'm distinguishing between the two. First of all, because a lot of the narratives, including major European leaders, are all the time saying if we don't spend money on the military now, we all should learn Russian tomorrow, which is the most insane, ridiculous thing to say. I mean, it is overvaluing Russian power by, a factor of 100 and undervaluing our own military power and even the agenda of Putin. Why would he want to invade us and force us to speak Russian? It's all complete insanity. And I'm saying that because that narrative is typically about, hey, Germans, you should be afraid of Russia, spend on the military, otherwise Germany should be terrified. Whereas in reality, obviously, that's not the case. I'm distinguishing there between Western Europe and NATO because of that, because a lot of the talk mixes these two things and makes it sound as if Russia is going to conquer the West. The one kind of scenario, and I don't think it's a particularly likely scenario to be clear, but it is possible following the pattern of Georgia and the pattern of course, Ukraine, would be where Russia, Putin, the Kremlin, says, hey, there are Russian minorities in Baltic states. We need to protect them. We're going to somehow do something against them, right? That is the one possible scenario. They're not going to invade Poland. They're not going to invade Germany. Russian tanks won't get to Madrid anytime soon. But there might be some possibility for that to occur. And the only way for those Baltic countries to be 100% secure in going to bed at night, knowing that what happened, is to make sure that either NATO protocols or ideally in the future European protocols will be robust and will be followed. So that the moment one Russian tank drives into Lithuania, Estonia, then there will be an immediate automatic reaction, declaration of war by NATO countries against. Now, technically, that's the way it should work, but there have been doubts about that, specifically with respect to the United States. And so what Europe needs to do is create protocols for itself, that even if the United States doesn't react, that Europe will automatically react. And that would make those Baltic countries completely safe.
I mean, and to a large extent, I think that at least part of these protocols already exist, probably without the US. Because the talk in Germany is always that there's German troops in Lithuania. I mean, there's only 1,500 of them. And I mean, so right, for the international relations students out there, you know that those are tripwire kind of soldiers, right? So that ideally, in a scenario of war, there's never an ideally, but that in case Russia were to invade Lithuania, the first person they would basically meet is a German. And then it immediately drags Germany into the war. But I mean, that kind of gets then to the second point in your free public service announcement. Even without the United States, Europe still spends 3 times as much on the military as Russia, right? I mean, the official numbers, and we've talked about this in a past episode at length, right? Is that in 2024, European NATO members spent $454 billion on the military, while Russia spent $149 billion on the military, right? So that's a big difference.
A huge difference. And it's not just a matter of spending, but it's also what kind of targets, what kind of objectives can be achieved with that kind of spending, right? So there is militarily no serious scenario in which Western Europe, including the Baltic countries, including Poland, so Central and Western Europe, could not defend itself against a Russian military aggression, which, by the way, is not going to come because of there is no reason for Putin to do this. Why would he invade Poland? Why would he do any of this?
I mean, he can't even finish off Ukraine.
No, exactly. The idea that if you live in Poland or you live in Germany, you have to worry about it. The only thing that you need to make sure of is exactly what you said. You want to make sure that the Putin knows, regardless of whether we think it would happen or not, that Germany would react, that Putin knows that the moment they set foot in Lithuania or Latvia or Estonia, there will be an immediate, automatic, non-negotiable reaction from the European Union, and there would be a war breaking out. And that would be sufficient. And that requires European countries to essentially reorganize themselves I would say move away from NATO, create this European Defence Force. We've discussed this in the past. And that requires a bit of extra spending if it's on the transition, right? That transition is expensive because there's a lot of structures that are still very much reliant on the United States. And to move away from that is not an easy process. So there, a bit of extra defense spending makes sense. Absolutely. However, we're not talking about 5% defense of GDP. That is insane. That is an enormous amount of money. And we are not talking about more tanks or more airplanes. We're simply talking about sufficient deterrent in terms of protocol.
And right, again, I unfortunately, I mean, so I have a complicated relationship with military spending. I personally think there's much more useful things we could do, right? We could invest heavily into diplomacy. We could make sure that, right, by following the Western Bubble podcast, that we're no longer creating more and more enemies all over the world. And then we could use a lot of money and spend it on useful things like the environment, education, schools, hippie things.
Well, and those hippie things are actually consistently, and we have overwhelming evidence about this historically, what actually makes a country strong, right? You want Europe to be strong? Invest in those hippie things. Invest in infrastructure, schools, education, healthcare, social security, also very important for a strong, consistent society, right? Because you make people want to belong to society rather than go to the extremes. So, and this is something that really frustrates me about this debate. People seem to be so obsessed with, first we were at 2%, now we go to 3.5%, then we have to go to 5% of GDP spending, not realizing that this is literally trillions of euros that could go into actually making your country stronger, setting yourself up for the long term. Investing in tanks, investing in airplanes has a little bit of technological spillover, sure, and it provides a bit of employment, sure, but it is not an effective, efficient way to spend your money if you want your societies to be strong. There are way more productive methods to spending your money. And the fact that people seem to think that this is just money coming from nowhere and isn't withdrawn from the things that they really care about is very disturbing to me, because this is literally trillions that should have gone to making your life better, rather than a bunch of tanks that will never be used because Russia is never going to invade.
And then ultimately, you said it before already, this might make the West the aggressor, right? Is if partly you're kind of propping up your military, you're getting all these toys that you at some point kind of want to use, right? By the way, that's my main theory on why Trump did it, right? Why Trump sent bombers to Iran, because he wanted to see those big, beautiful bombs explode, right? Those bunker busters that no one else but himself has. That's just how Trump thinks. At least that's my assumption, right? But I'm concerned that Europeans might have those inklings as well at some point. Right, you're kind of setting yourself up to be the aggressor, right? You're kind of constantly creating enemies from the outside. You're putting up walls. You're putting up huge machine guns behind these walls. And at some point, you need to do a preemptive strike because you kind of see that the other side is putting up walls as well.
Well, and you're creating a culture of violence, of military violence. You are basically mentally preparing for this, and it comes again from a relative position of luxury, right? It comes from a place where these European policymakers kind of know that what we are saying is true. I mean, I've never spoken to Rutte, I've never met the man in my life, even though he's Dutch, but we don't all know each other apparently. You would think so, but no. But I would love to know from his psychologist whether he actually believes the stuff he says, because with a little bit of reasoning you understand that Putin is not a military threat. Nuclear war is a military threat, right? I mean, if World War III does break out, and then Russia has the capability of destroying us all, but for that you don't need conventional weaponry. You just need to make sure that Russia doesn't want to send nuclear weapons to us. The idea that we are actually the victim is, of course, insanity. And these policy leaders must know that. They must, somewhere in the back of their mind, understand that they're more powerful than Russia. So then, the argument is the same as why the United States bombs Iran, because they are essentially, it is useful internally for political purposes, it's useful for some kind of foreign policy agendas, and they drag the country into acts of war, thinking that they will be able to weather the storm. And the United States bombing Iran is one thing. European countries preemptively striking against Russia is a whole different kettle of fish.
This seems like a great moment to end today's conversation on just so many things. Wow, Balder, we've talked for a long time. If you have any questions, comments, or you heard a mistake that we've made throughout the episode, please make sure to send us an email to thewesternbubble@gmail.com. We will try to incorporate them in our following episodes. Thank you very much to the listeners for joining us today. Make sure you join us again next week when we burst the Western Bubble. That is it from my side. Balder, which closing quote did you pick for us today?
A long episode, a short quote from a 19th century countryman of yours, Otto von Bismarck, who said, "Preventive war is like committing suicide out of fear of death."